Cologne, 1642. The servants hesitated before opening the door, not from fear of their queen, but fear of the smell leaking from under it. When they pushed it open, the stench hit them like a physical blow. On the bed lay Maria de Medici, her legs swollen and blackened, her breath rattling through lungs filling with infected fluid. France declared a peaceful passing, but eyewitness letters reveal the real cause: untreated diabetes, unchecked infection, and gangrene spreading so fast she could smell her own flesh dying. To understand how a queen reached this point, we rewind, back to the years of pain disguised as royal ceremony, the pregnancies that ruined her circulation, the bloodletting that stole her strength, the mercury that poisoned her immune system, the political betrayal that exiled her. Each wound, each journey, each humiliation, tightening the trap around her until her body simply couldn't fight anymore. But the darkest truth isn't just the gangrene, it's the calculated neglect. A royal court, a son, and an entire nation made a choice to look away and let their queen rot alone in a foreign room. And what happens next reveals a second, even more brutal violation, proving that long after the gangrene, her enemies still weren't finished with her body. But before we open this forgotten chamber, hit like and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps resurrect these buried stories. Before the stench in Cologne, before the rotting bed and the burned bandages, there was a girl with ankles that would not stop swelling. Maria de Medici grows up in a world of carved stone and polished marble, but her own body felt like a volatile machine, always heavy, always resisting. Court observers note, almost casually at first, that her legs puff after standing, that her shoes leave marks in the skin. A scrape on the shin takes weeks to close. A blister from a tight slipper seeps clear fluid long after it should have hardened into a scar. In another family, this would just be unfortunate. In the Medici orbit, it is something more dangerous, a flaw that can be exploited, a weakness that might one day need to be hidden. The Medici name is a blessing and a curse. This is a dynasty where people die suddenly, and no one ever says the word natural. Uncles taken by a fever after a dinner, cousins collapsing after a cup of wine, rivals wasting away on diets of broth and suspicion. In that atmosphere, a girl whose skin bruises easily and whose wounds heal slowly is living with a loaded gun under the table every day. Chronic edema and fragile circulation aren't just medical problems here. They are fuel for whispers. If your legs are swollen, someone can say you've been poisoned. If you are exhausted, someone can say your enemies are already at work. And in a world where gossip can kill, those rumours can become as lethal as any toxin. Maria learns young that her body gives her away. When she tires, her movements grow heavy, her gait changes, and the stiffness in her limbs is obvious to anyone watching. She is not the effortless, glowing ideal of a Renaissance princess gliding through galleries. She's a girl who has to think about every step, who pays for every long ceremony with hours of throbbing pain in her legs. According to later descriptions, she spends more time sitting than the other girls, more time resting between appearances. That's where the psychological horror begins, in the gap between what her bloodline demands and what her blood vessels can actually deliver. Every ache becomes a question. Is this just bad circulation, or is someone testing a new poison? Is this dizziness from standing too long in a hot chapel, or the first sign that the wine at dinner was touched? The constant physical anxiety wasn't just mental torment, it was a political liability. In a family saturated with treason and assassination, Maria learns that symptoms are evidence. She's not just sick, she's indictable. That fear changes her behaviour. She clings to physicians, demands purges and cleansings, allows blood to be drawn because someone insists it will carry away the bad humours. Each visit is meant to protect her from imaginary poisoners, yet every treatment drains a little more strength from a circulatory system that's already failing. The sabotage is complete. The irony is brutal. The more she fears being killed from the outside, the more she allows her body to be sabotaged from the inside. By the time she's old enough to be considered as a dynastic bride, Maria is already trapped in a pattern that will follow her to France. A swollen, exhausted body wrapped in layers of silk, and a mind primed to interpret every twinge as an attack. The legend of the queen who rotted alive doesn't begin in a filthy room in Cologne. It begins here, in a young woman quietly learning that her own veins, her own skin, her own healing wounds cannot be relied on. Because the first real step toward that gangrenous bed isn't an infection or a bandage gone wrong. It's a girl absorbing one simple, terrifying lesson, that her body is both the battlefield and the weapon that will eventually kill her. And once that belief takes root, every future injury is going to land twice as hard. When Maria de' Medici entered the French court as the new queen, her body stopped being hers. It became a state machine, expected to produce heirs on schedule no matter the cost. And the cost began immediately. In just 9 years, she delivered 6 children. Contemporary accounts describe her pregnancies as burdensome and her recoveries as slow and incomplete, which, in 17th century medical language, was a polite way of saying her body was breaking down. The swelling in her legs became constant. Walking required assistance. By her 3rd pregnancy, servants reported she often gripped furniture just to stand. But the real damage came from the doctors. These were not physicians as we understand them today. They were practitioners of a brutal medieval toolkit, procedures rooted in superstition, not science, and Maria became their perfect target, a queen who had no right to refuse. Every time she complained of fatigue, headaches, or heavy limbs, the solution was the same: open a vein. Bloodletting was performed again and again, even during recovery from childbirth. Each session drained an already weakened circulatory system. Each session pushed her body closer to long-term vascular collapse. Then came the mercury. Court physicians believed mercury purged impurities. Modern medicine calls it what it is: a neurotoxin and an immunological wrecking ball. Records show Maria received topical mercury rubs and internal doses meant to balance the humours. Instead, they shredded her immune function and made even small wounds dangerously slow to heal. The swelling in her legs grew worse. Her skin grew fragile. Minor infections became chronic. Every year of marriage carved a deeper weakness into her body, weakness that would later become gangrene's perfect entry point. But to the court, this decline was invisible. Queens were expected to smile, to walk, to appear capable even when their bones and blood said otherwise. Maria hid the pain under brocade gowns and layers of Chanel white lead makeup that only worsened her skin. By the time her 6th child was born, Maria was no longer a healthy woman struggling through royal life. She was a woman whose body had been medically sabotaged in the name of duty. An entire system had mistaken slow organ damage for treatment. And no one, not a doctor, not a priest, not a single member of the court, paused long enough to ask what their cures were doing to her. And the horrifying truth is this: the rot didn't begin in that final room in Cologne. It began here, in the royal bedchamber, in the medical chambers, in every forced treatment her body endured. Because the next stage of her downfall wouldn't come from disease alone, but from power, politics, and a betrayal that would accelerate every wound already festering inside her. When Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, Maria de' Medici didn't just inherit a throne, she inherited a job that her body was physically unprepared to perform. As regent for the young Louis XIII, she spent entire days seated in rigid ceremonial posture, receiving ambassadors, signing decrees, and attending councils that dragged on for hours. And for a woman already battling severe edema, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was medically disastrous. Blood pooled in her legs, circulation slowed to a crawl, the tissues in her calves and ankles began starving for oxygen. Within a few years, the symptoms described in court letters became unmistakable. She walked with difficulty, her legs were wrapped daily, and attendants discreetly disposed of stained bandages. These weren't simple skin irritations. They were chronic venous ulcers, wet, open wounds that leaked fluid and never closed. And they only grew worse. Sitting still was killing her, but standing was agony. Every audience with foreign envoys, every council session with Richelieu's faction watching for weakness, every ceremony demanding elaborate stillness, pushed the infection deeper. Her role as regent was accelerating the rot inside her, but Maria could not show a single crack. Not in a French court that already viewed her as an intrusive Florentine. So she hid the decay. She hid the swelling under heavy brocaded gowns. She hid the discoloration and fever sweat beneath layers of lead-based white paint that ate her skin even as it concealed it. She hid the smell with thick, cloying perfume, so strong that one visitor noted it, announced her arrival before her footsteps did. This wasn't vanity, it was political survival. A visible ulcer in the 17th century was not just medical weakness, it was a weapon her enemies could use against her. And Maria had many enemies. As the pain worsened, she grew increasingly irritable, paranoid, and volatile. Chronic pain narrows the world until every conversation feels like a threat. And in Maria's world, many conversations were. Richelieu manoeuvred against her. Nobles whispered about replacing her. Foreign ambassadors sent home quiet reports about the Queen's declining vigour. Her body was failing her, and the court was watching. And then, here's the break point, the turn everything had been sliding toward. The political disaster that would rip her from power and throw her weakened body into chaos. The day of the dupes, a single failed gambit that ended her regency overnight and pushed her physical collapse into freefall. By 1630, Maria de' Medici was a regent whose political ambition was rising, even as her body was collapsing. The swelling in her legs had worsened, the ulcers had begun to leak more frequently, and chronic fatigue forced her to sit for long stretches, an unspoken sign of weakness in a court where vitality was a form of currency. Yet she still believed she had the strength to strike at the man who had eclipsed her, Cardinal Richelieu. The day of the dupe unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. Maria executed a carefully planned political manoeuvre intended to remove Richelieu from power once and for all. She used her long-standing influence over the royal family, years of accumulated resentment, and the fragile emotional bond with her son, King Louis XIII, to push the cardinal to the brink of dismissal. For several hours, the French court genuinely believed the government was about to change hands. High-ranking nobles began shifting their allegiances. Corridors filled with speculation. Carriages repositioned themselves in anticipation of a new political order. And then the momentum reversed. Louis XIII re-evaluated the situation away from Maria's presence. Richelieu regained access to him. A few strategic conversations, a handful of urgent memoranda, and the king turned away from his mother entirely. By evening, the balance of power had flipped so thoroughly that Maria's faction evaporated. Richelieu did not merely survive, he emerged with more authority than before. For Maria, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. This political rupture struck at a body already under extreme physiological strain. Chronic illness does not tolerate emotional shocks. Her edema intensified. The inflamed tissue in her legs became hotter, more painful, and more unstable. The fatigue deepened to a level that contemporary observers described as sudden and drastic physical decline. The failure of her coup was not just a loss of political power, it was a physical blow that her damaged circulation could not absorb. Within days, courtiers noted a visible transformation. The queen who once commanded a regency now moved slowly, grimaced with every step and relied more heavily on cushions and attendants. Her skin changed colour. Her posture slumped. Her presence no longer radiated authority. It radiated deterioration. And in a court obsessed with appearances, this shift was fatal. Whispers began circulating in an environment where rumours carried political weight. Officials read her illness as weakness. Foreign ambassadors recorded the sudden loss of influence in dispatches. Even her closest supporters began distancing themselves. The machinery of the French state had recalibrated around Richelieu, and Maria found herself on the outside within hours. The day of the dupe did not end with a political defeat. It marked the moment the French monarchy decided that Maria's presence was no longer an asset but a liability. Richelieu now had the justification he needed to isolate her politically and geographically. Louis XIV, increasingly guided by his minister, stepped aside from his mother both emotionally and administratively. Her body had been failing for years, but this was the moment her world collapsed with it. And the next step, already forming behind closed doors, was far harsher than a loss of power. The decision to remove her from the centre of the kingdom altogether. The exile was coming, and her failing legs would be forced to endure it. After the political collapse of 1630, The French court no longer treated Maria de' Medici as a former regent or the mother of a king. She became a logistical problem, an inconvenient presence whose declining health and rising bitterness threatened the stability of the regime. The official record claims she was sent to Compiègne for rest, a sanitized phrase that masked the truth. It was house arrest disguised as compassion. Compiègne was not a sanctuary. It was a containment zone. Guards monitored her movement, courtiers withdrew, supplies were rationed with calculated indifference. The isolation quickly worsened her already failing body. Walking had been difficult before. Now it became agonizing. The chronic ulcers on her legs leaked constantly, requiring fresh bandages each morning and again at night. Servants struggled to keep the dressings clean. Infection thrived under even the slightest delay. Each step stretched inflamed tissue that refused to heal. Her circulation, already compromised, faltered under the forced inactivity. Swelling increased. The skin around the ulcers softened and tore easily. Standing caused throbbing pressure. Sitting for too long caused pooling that made the next movement unbearable. Her body had begun to trap her long before the crown abandoned her, but now the political machinery ensured there was no escape. Then Louis XIII removed the remaining guards. It was framed as leniency. In reality, it was a threat. Without protection, without resources, without political allies, a sick and disabled woman was expected to leave on her own or starve where she sat. This was not an invitation. It was an eviction. The monarchy had found a way to exile its own mother without issuing a formal decree. For a healthy traveller, the road from Compiègne was harsh. Uneven terrain, long stretches of mud, cold winds slicing through wooden carriage seams. For Maria de' Medici, it was torture. Her legs, swollen and infected, could not withstand the constant vibration of travel. Every jolt of the carriage sent a shock of pain through her body, striking the deep ulcers that had eroded past the skin and into soft tissue. Bandages soaked through with fluid long before each day's end. Servants attempted to tighten the wrappings mid-journey, but the movement only tore the wounds more. The strain extended beyond pain. The fevers grew more frequent. The swelling in her feet made even the act of stepping out of the carriage a calculated risk. She travelled for survival, but the journey itself accelerated the decay spreading under her skin. When she finally reached safety outside French jurisdiction, she carried not just a failing body but a new political identity. She was branded disloyal, unstable, and untrustworthy. The court defined her flight as betrayal, erasing the fact that she had been forced into motion by abandonment. From this moment forward, every European power treated her as a liability. She was too royal to ignore, too dangerous to protect, and too sick to be of use. Maria de' Medici had lived most of her life inside the most powerful courts in Europe. Now she crossed borders as a burden. No nation wanted to claim her. No government offered refuge. Her name, once a political asset, became a warning. She had become the rarest and bleakest of royal figures, a queen with no country, dragging a body already collapsing from the inside. And the next chapter of her life would push that collapse, and the stench that followed her, far beyond anything the French court had feared. Maria de' Medici fled France with the hope that Brussels might offer stability, if not political support, then at least physical safety. Instead, the journey only deepened the damage that exile had already carved into her body. The roads were rough, sanitation was nearly non-existent, and every mile pushed her ulcers further into irreversible decay. The bandages she left Compiègne with were already failing. Within days they were soaked, foul-smelling, and useless. Brussels welcomed her not as a queen, but as an obligation. Foreign courts knew her name carried weight, but that weight came with risk. Hosting a disgraced mother of the French king was a diplomatic hazard. She was tolerated, not embraced, positioned in guest quarters, and then quietly relocated whenever the smell of infection became too noticeable or the complaints too frequent. Her condition was no longer simply a medical problem. It had become a sensory assault, the kind that no palace etiquette could conceal. Her body betrayed her in ways that stripped away any remaining dignity. The ulcers on her legs, deepened by months of strain, no longer sealed between bandage changes. They leaked continuously, pooling at her ankles, staining whatever fabric she wore. Servants tried to clean the floors behind her. They failed. The smell, rank, sweet, unmistakably septic, followed her into corridors, into prayer rooms, into any space she entered. Foreign aristocrats avoided her for reasons that went far beyond politics. Recurring fevers left her delirious and sweating. Nights were punctured by uncontrolled chills and hacking coughs, each one rattling the infected pockets of fluid inside her body. The untreated wounds crusted and reopened daily, refusing to heal. The inflammation around her legs began to shine and split from the pressure. Courtiers exchanged glances and complaints behind closed doors. She was not just inconvenient, she was unbearable, and poverty arrived as the final humiliation. Exile drained her finances with speed. She had no state treasury, no reliable income, no court infrastructure to maintain her. To pay for lodging, medicines, and servants, she sold her jewellery piece by piece until the last of her valuables disappeared into foreign hands. Her gowns, once symbols of power, became resources to cut apart, restitch, and repurpose. She wore garments already soiled because she could not afford replacements, and the stains only deepened the stigma surrounding her. By the time rumours of her rot began circulating through diplomatic channels, the reality had already surpassed the whispers. Her decay was no longer metaphorical. The smell of death was with her years before she died. She entered courts as a fugitive queen, but she moved through them like a slow-moving omen, an odour, a shadow, a reminder of how quickly power could collapse into flesh that refused to heal. And with every border crossed, her condition grew worse, ensuring that the final chapter of her life, waiting for her in the damp, narrow house in Cologne, would be darker than anything she'd endured so far. Maria de' Medici's final refuge was not a palace, not a monastery, not even a respectable townhouse. It was the small, damp residence of the painter Peter Paul Rubens in Cologne, a structure never meant to host a former queen, let alone one whose body was already collapsing under the weight of decades of infection. The floors sagged, the walls sweated moisture, and the air was thick with the smell of mould and stagnant water. For a healthy person, it was uncomfortable. For Maria, it was lethal. Poor sanitation destroyed any chance her wounds had to stabilize. Moisture clung to her bandages, turning them into breeding grounds for bacteria. Each time they were peeled away, more skin came with them. The ulcers that once wept now deepened into open cavities, dark, soft-edged craters that sank toward the bone. Servants described them as blackening at the rims, an early mark of necrosis. She spent most days bedridden because standing sent shocks of pain up her legs, tearing whatever fragile tissue still clung to life. Medical historians, reviewing her preserved symptoms, extreme swelling, chronic fatigue, infections that refused to heal, identify a pattern with chilling clarity: untreated type 2 diabetes. In the 17th century, the disease had no name, no treatment, and no understanding. Its complications, however, were mercilessly predictable. Her circulation, already damaged by years of pregnancies, stress and bloodletting, deteriorated into full-blown peripheral artery disease. Blood flow to her legs dwindled to almost nothing. Without oxygen or nutrients, tissue simply stopped surviving. In that damp house, every physiological failure accelerated. Dead skin accumulated faster than servants could clean it. Dark patches spread across her calves and ankles, soft to the touch and foul-smelling, the unmistakable beginning of gangrene. The room itself became an incubator. Heat from the fireplace created humidity. The poorly ventilated walls held it in. Bacteria thrived. Infection moved upward, inch by inch, finding new tissue to devour. Her lungs weakened as fever came in waves. The swelling in her limbs spread to her hands and face. On bad days, she drifted in and out of delirium, muttering through the pain as her body fought a losing battle on every front. There was no doctor skilled enough to stop it, no money left to buy relief, and no nation willing to claim the responsibility of saving her. Even the painter's own household saw her as a burden they could neither refuse nor fully care for. By the time the first patches of gangrene turned fully black, the process was irreversible. She was no longer fighting an illness. She was being consumed by it, and Cologne, cold, wet, indifferent, was the last place she would ever see. The rot had begun its final advance, and in this cramped, airless room, the Queen of France was already dying inch by inch, long before her heart stopped beating. By the summer of 1642, Maria de' Medici's body had crossed the final threshold. What had begun as swelling, then ulcers, then necrotic patches now transformed into a full-scale biological collapse. The tissue on her legs turned black, not bruised, not infected, but dead. The colour was unmistakable, a deep, matte, lifeless charcoal that crept across her skin like advancing mould. The smell was worse than anything her attendants had endured before, sweet, sulphuric, thick enough to cling to clothing and hair. Servants covered their faces before entering the room, yet even through layers of linen and lavender oil the stench of decay punched through. Each time the bandages were removed, they didn't simply reveal the wound, they took part of her with them. Strips of skin, clumps of soft, broken tissue, even small flakes of bone adhered to the cloth. The servants, many of whom had tended nobles all their lives, were now ordered to burn every dressing immediately after use. Washing was pointless. The fabric couldn't be saved. The Queen's own body was turning into something hazardous. The infection no longer stayed confined to her legs. Her fever surged without warning, climbing fast, dropping, then climbing higher. She drifted into confusion, sometimes unable to recognize the faces around her. She muttered to herself, grasped at blankets, begged for water she could barely swallow. These were clear signs of sepsis, an infection that had entered the bloodstream and was now attacking every organ at once. Her body was losing coherence, system by system. Her lungs were next to fail. Fluid filled the space around them, a condition modern medicine identifies as pleurisy. But in 1642, it meant only one thing: drowning from the inside. Her breaths became shallow at first, then slower, then wet. Each inhale came with a bubbling sound, as if air were struggling to push through thick liquid. Each exhale was a weak, rattling groan. Servants described the noise as unbearable, a sound that made even hardened attendants step back from the bedside. Her legs, massively swollen, barely resembled human limbs anymore. Her fingers puffed to double their size. Her skin took on a waxy sheen. She did not sit up. She did not rise. She barely responded to touch. She was a queen in name only. What lay in that bed was a body being emptied by disease, piece by piece. On July 3rd, 1642, Maria de' Medici finally stopped breathing. There were no royal physicians present, no courtiers, no priests by her side in her final seconds. Just a handful of exhausted servants in a damp room that smelled of rot, failure, and the end of a long, humiliating decline. The woman who once ruled France died swollen, infected, and alone. And as they prepared her corpse, one horrifying truth became undeniable. Maria had not simply died. She had been devoured by gangrene, by sepsis, by a lifetime of untreated disease, and by a world that abandoned her long before her heart gave out. Maria de' Medici's death should have ended her suffering. In 1643, her body, already ravaged beyond recognition, was transported back to France. There was no triumph, no grand procession, no court-wide mourning. The woman who once ruled as queen and regent was given a quiet burial in the royal necropolis of Saint-Denis, sealed among generations of French monarchs. It was a final gesture of legitimacy for a woman who had died stripped of dignity. For a time, the stone above her gave the illusion of peace, but history wasn't finished with her. In 1793, during the French Revolution, Saint-Denis became a target. Revolutionaries, driven by rage, symbolism, and the desire to erase monarchy at its roots, broke into the basilica and smashed open the royal tombs. Coffins were pried apart. Bodies, bones, and fragments of once sacred remains were dragged out into the open. Maria's remains, fragile and already compromised by the decay she endured in life, were exhumed and tossed unceremoniously into a massive communal pit with kings, queens, princes, and saints. The pit was quicklime, mud, and chaos. Whatever still held her shape dissolved in days. She had rotted once by disease, now she rotted again by revolution. Years later, in 1817, long after the chaos had passed, the Bourbon monarchy attempted to restore dignity to what was left of the royal dead. Workers sifted through the mixed pit of skeletal fragments. They gathered what could be salvaged, hundreds of bones from dozens of bodies, and placed them together in an ossuary. No names, no individual markers, just an anonymous chamber of commingled remains beneath stone floors meant to look orderly and reverent. Maria de' Medici, once Queen of France, ended as an indistinguishable piece of a nameless pile. Her body decayed in life, consumed by ulcers, infection, and gangrene. Her legacy decayed in death, stripped of identity, scattered into a pit, and reburied without a trace. She was eaten alive by her own failing flesh, then torn apart by the forces of history. In the end, Maria de' Medici, queen, regent, mother of a king, became what every neglected life eventually becomes when memory fails: anonymous dust. This was one queen's final collapse. But she's not the only one history tried to bury twice. Subscribe if you want more chapters dug out from under dust, denial, and the bodies left behind.